The Forces tab is going to allow us to control the individual forces that can occur between the hairs, and it can also allow us to use the particle force objects that can be found here to affect the hairs. The first set of options that you see here are going to allow us to, first of all, enable hair-to-hair forces, and this will be the actual forces that the hairs themselves are creating. You can enable surface-to-hair forces, and this will allow you to use a polygon object to exert forces onto the hair. And finally, you have an edit field for gravity, and it's currently set to negative 9.81, which means it's a downward force on the y-axis. So if we just hit play, you'll see that eventually all the guides kind of fall to the ground. If we adjust the gravity to 0, you'll see that nothing happens, and that's because there's no longer any force being exerted from gravity on these guides. So now that there's no other forces acting on the hair, this is the perfect time to show you the hair-to-hair forces. If we click on the checkbox, you'll see the first thing that happens is the hairs move in the viewport. Now what's more important to notice is that the hairs are actually being repelled away from each other. So if you watch very closely when it starts here, that these hairs are separating in a fashion that radiates outwards. If we go to the hair-to-hair drop-down, you'll be able to set many of the parameters here that you use to control the forces between these hairs. The first option is radius. With radius, what you have to do is imagine that on each one of these hairs there is a cylinder or a circle that's kind of swept along its length. So the radius is going to give you the value in units from the center of the hair, or the actual guide itself, and then you would go out towards the edge. So from here to here could be the 5-inch radius. Next you have a strength parameter, and this is going to allow you to define the value or the amount of repulsion that your hairs have. So with a value of 60, you'll see that the hairs are pushing away from each other quite quickly. And if we adjust the strength to something much lower, like say 1, and then go back to the beginning, you'll see that the hairs are pushing away from each other much slower, and that's because they have a lot less strength. Now in some cases, you may not want the hair to actually push away from each other, but you may want the hairs to attract towards each other. And in that case, you are able to enter negative values into the strength field. So with a strength of -1, you'll see that the hairs are now pulling towards each other. And in some cases this can cause artifacts, so you will have to work very carefully with these values. Next you have the max strength parameter, and this is going to work almost as a clamping value on your actual strength parameter. And this can be used to help avoid some of those situations where the hair might explode apart, like you saw in this situation here. So when these hairs here get close enough, they kind of break apart. Now, this is one instance where you might try lowering the max strength. We can try a value such as 1, which might even be the default, or 10 is the default, but we still get issues here. So what we could do is actually look at the dynamic simulation, and we can go to the advanced dropdown and check out the steps. Currently it's set to 3, and you'll remember that steps is going to control the number of divisions between frames, and if we have fast movements, sometimes we need more steps. So let's go ahead and try adding more steps there. We'll go with 10 steps, and let's just go to the beginning of the simulation. And you'll see that it's running much slower now, as it is calculating the forces between all these guides. But once we get to the point where it usually explodes, things tend to react a little bit more stable now. So it's definitely all about finding a balance when you are working with the dynamics. The final dropdown that we have here in the hair-to-hair menu is the fall-off. And by default it's going to be set to square, but you can use any of the default settings here, and you can even create your own custom fall-off with the spline graph. So what the fall-off is describing is the amount of force that is going to be distributed along the radius that we set in the radius parameter here. So if we take a look at the custom falloff, currently it is set to 1 on the left side here and 1 on the right side. And these values are going to be mapped along the radius that you set in the parameter here. So essentially, if we have the base or the entire guide here, we'll have a strength of 1 at the center, and if we go all the way out to that 5-inch radius, the strength will still be 1. If we set the custom graph here so that the top or the left side is still set to 1, but the right side is set to 0, the result that we'll get is a strength of 1 close to the hair, and then as we go out to that 5-inch radius mark here, the strength is going to go all the way down to 0. So this way we now have a fall off on the strength between hairs. The next checkbox that we have is surface to hair. So in this case you'll see that we have a sphere added to the scene. And if we take a look at the object manager, there is also a hair collider tag attached to the sphere. In the hair collider tag, you have an option to enable the forces checkbox here. And this is going to allow you to set very similar settings to what you saw in the hair object itself in the hair to hair settings. So the settings that you see in the hair collider tag are going to allow you to control the force generated by this polygon object. In this case, I'm saying that the force has a radius of 30 inches, so that's going to be 30 inches from the center of the polygon object, or wherever the axis of the object is located, and then a strength of 16, and again that max strength is there. And you can also set the custom fall off if you wish. If we go back to the hair object itself, and then click on play, you'll see that nothing happens. If we go back to the beginning, enable surface to hair, and it is important to note that the object is not intersecting with the hairs at all. There is a gap there. We can now click play, and you'll see that the feedback is significantly slower, but now we have the hairs being pushed away from this object. If we go to that hair collider tag and add in a negative strength value, let's just restart this, we can actually get the hairs to pull into the object. And you'll see that it almost looks like they're attaching to the object itself. We then have a drop-down for force objects. And if you take a look at this drop-down, it actually gives us a mode to exclude or include specific objects, and then a link list where we can drag in the force objects we wish to use. Let's start by going to the particle menu and adding a wind force. We can then hit play, and you'll see that all of the hairs are being affected by the wind now. If we select the rotate tool and try rotating the wind, you'll see that it adjusts the direction that the hairs are being blown. If we go back to the hair object and back to the force dropdown, we can now use the link list here as a way of managing the forces. Let's go ahead and duplicate the wind and have this one pointing along the z-axis. In this case, you'll see that the hairs are now moving in a direction that's kind of an average between those two wind forces. Now, if we drag one of the wind forces into the exclude list, as it's set by the mode, you'll see that we only get the force from one of the wind objects. And in this case, let's go ahead and name this one X, and this one will be Z, because those are the axes that they're moving along. So the X is moving along the X, because that is the one that is currently not set in the exclude list. So Z is being excluded. If we change the mode to include, now it's going to only use the forces that are in this list, and exclude everything else. So the hairs are now being blown along the Z-axis, but not the X.